If you're a Victoria 3 player, there are many potential reactions you may be having to the recent news about the Sphere of Influence DLC's delay. Some people are grateful that the DLC will be given more time to cook, some are upset that the delay was so massive, being pushed more than a month back, and others are simply even more sure that they were right about Victoria 3 being trash all along. Even more so though, there's a lot of discussion about the quality of the proposed mechanics in the game. Foreign investment, lobbying, blocks, journal entries, subject interactions, all that good stuff. So many mechanics are being discussed, and I often get asked in my stream what I think about these things. I like to give the boring answer of, the ideas sound good, we won't know until it comes out, and this is a sentiment I've increasingly clung to in recent time. This sort of cautious optimism came upon me after Legends of the Dead came out for CK3. The DLC had amazing ideas, and in so having, I believed also inherently possessed quality. Ideas and implementations of those ideas are about as far apart as alligators and crocodiles, which is to say, not particularly distant, but often mistaken as one and the same. Legends of the Dead for CK3 brought us legends, which spread on the map in the same way as plagues do. This idea, this concept, is amazing. Stories do indeed spread like plagues, and one could even say they evolve like plagues. To connect the two concepts was, for me, such an immense leap in creativity and thought that I was thoroughly assured of the quality of the DLC. It was only when I received early access to the DLC and sat there, NDA embargo signed, that I got to play the DLC and saw how lackluster it was. I made a review about it, which you can watch for more information, but I want to emphasize what the point of this little aside is. A great idea was ruined by an awful implementation, and this is an extremely important thing to understand when considering what Victoria 3's DLC has to offer. I want to discuss properly what I think about Victoria 3's upcoming DLC, keeping in mind that ideas are just ideas, and instead of considering the potential pitfalls of the implementation of those ideas, alongside the equal opportunities for greatness in those pitfalls. No one can say for sure whether the DLC will be any good, but what I've learned from Crusader Kings 3 is that snatching mediocrity from the jaws of fun is easier than it might seem. Understanding the ideas of the DLC first requires understanding its intentions, which we can pretty easily deduce from the mechanics themselves. The DLC centers on power blocks, foreign investments, and subjects, which I think all point to, in one way or another, diplomacy. You can clap now for my ability to point out the obvious, thank you. So the interactions between countries in Victoria 3, as an idea, is definitely a solid focus for a DLC. In a game all about the Victorian era, having countries interact, both hostile and friendly, in ways which meaningfully affect the world is important, and we will have a plethora of ways to do so. Diplomacy in its current implementation in the game is best described by the word schizo, in my opinion, with the AI sometimes doing insane plays, or refusing to be helpful. Sometimes other countries will act in their own disinterest, or choose to tear down their entire nation to prolong a war over nothing. Very much unlike the Victorian states upon which this AI is meant to be based, the AI diplomacy in this game treats every conflict as if it were the Great War and a fight for survival. Every war will prompt the mobilization of an overwhelming fighting force, and there is no negotiation in a diplomatic play. There is no compromise, nor intervention. All diplomacy leads to war, or total unconditional surrender on one side. There is neither escalation, nor de-escalation, nor even proportionality, as a war over a colony will evoke the same ferocity as a war for the capital. This is Victoria 3's Schizo AI, and this is where my very first concern comes up. You see, this DLC is, from what I can tell, a load of tools being dumped into the sandbox toolset of Victoria 3, but I think we shouldn't forget the monsters that lurk in the box with us when we receive these tools. I don't know how nationalization will work in this DLC. None of us do. Would it surprise me if the AI schizophrenically nationalizes foreign investments from nations which it has perfect relations with? Not at all. I don't know how interest-group lobbies will work either, but would it surprise me if the AI chooses to either completely ignore or blindly pursue the interests of the lobbyers? Not even a bit. Foreign investment is a mechanic which many have wanted for a long time. Finally, you can force your Dominion of Siam to make opium and silk instead of more textile mills. How will the AI make use of this mechanic? Will the AI understand the idea of making raw materials in the subject to create manufactured goods for itself? I would not at all be surprised to see an AI Britain slapping down steel mills in Bengal because it sees high productivity. To step away from all the examples, I think you understand my point of looking at the implementations of the ideas we have here. It's important to remember that every mechanic and its ideas could be genius, and then we could watch it all fall away to the tragedy of an incompetent AI. I don't just want to talk about the AI though, since this is about more than that. I want to talk about how the player might interact with something like foreign investment and nationalization. Every tool has its use, and some tools have overlapping usages. For example, in the current game, both trade and customs unions cover a similar problem, that is, a lack of supply or demand for a particular resource, but act as different proportional responses to that problem. The tool that is foreign investment could fill quite a few different niches, with it being a way to maybe gain relations with another nation, or a way to gain resources, among potential for many others. For all we know, enough foreign investment with the intention of inciting a nationalization of those resources could be a new technique for justifying war with someone. My question comes down to whether or not the tools provided will be interesting enough to warrant their own existence. Will I find myself making use of the foreign investment mechanic in interesting and dynamic ways? It's entirely possible that I won't, but we won't know until the DLC actually comes out and we have an idea of what the mechanic is actually like in terms of how it fits into the current tapestry of mechanics. I don't normally like to be overly vague in videos like this, but I've learned over time with recent Paradox releases that we can never be quite sure what exactly an implementation will look like. I think it would be easy to point to the dev diaries, which I know by now many of you have thought of as guides for what's coming, and while I'd normally agree, the dev diaries can sometimes fail to consider situations that only players might be thinking of, or which might be unintuitive. As a quick example, consider the support independence button from Dev Diary 111. It talks about how you can promise to join a subject's war for independence, and then, and I quote, it says, "Once the diplomatic play has been declared, any supporters will automatically join on the subject's side." If this is anything like the current reverse sway system, we're going to see players joining plays and immediately leaving them once the war starts. Many players will quickly grab an obligation from a power by supporting their war, and then capitulate the day after the war starts without any consequences and walk away with their obligation. This is even worse when asking for a bankroll, which can potentially significantly hamper a nation in return for absolutely nothing. I don't see anything in here about being obliged to stay in the war, and I also don't see anything about the AI feeling particularly motivated to mobilize for that war. Although to be fair, the AI is pretty gung-ho about mobilization, so I imagine being supported by the AI will indeed save you from your nefarious overlord. Another vague entry is the significant cost of denying your overlord's demand for a new law, or better yet, the numerical factors that go into a subject accepting your demands of them. For all we know, it'll be almost impossible to ask a subject to change laws, or it'll be too easy, or it'll just be nonsensical. Only time will tell. To me, dev diaries are idea showcases, not implementation showcases, especially from Paradox. And to be fair, that's to be expected. It's completely acceptable that dev diaries ultimately are ideas to show, not mechanics to present. But I think it's important that readers like us acknowledge the truth that these systems can be as cool in concept as we want, but ultimately we know nothing about the quality of their implementation. Anyway, I want to move on towards talking a bit about the particular mechanics now and put forward some specifics about how exactly the mechanics, at least in my view, should be implemented. In case you don't want to hear my opinion, in which case, fair enough I guess, I'll leave you with this. Consider carefully every piece on the board before you make your judgments, and avoid falling for the toxic optimism that clouds many Paradox fans' vision, while at the same time, avoiding the crushing pain of a more pessimistic view. This DLC can be good, and if it is, that should be celebrated. If it's not, that should be critiqued. But no matter what it will be, we don't yet know what it is. Jumping right into things, Dev Diary 109 covers power blocks, and this is something which certainly could be an epic implementation. Power blocks remind me of the culture system of Crusader Kings 3, or the Stellaris government civics. It looks like power blocks will be a kind of modular system, with the block having a defining identity, and then some principles to add to it. Those principles contribute to cohesion, which is like legitimacy, and I'm already having some questions. It seems like principles are the principal way of creating a unique block, but how restrictive and more importantly how viable are each of these principles? Consider something like industry banned in Victoria 3, which although when it first came out was completely pointless, has now found the niche use of being useful in colonies as a way to make sure they only make agricultural goods. I get the feeling that very quickly it will be decided which principles are the best and which aren't even worth getting, and that will be that. But let's say that doesn't happen. Then the feature could be a lot like companies. Although companies often kind of have a "this is the best option" feel to them, they do provide a lot of identity to the nation using them at the very least, and they are important to how you play since the buildings they can give throughput to can more or less define your specialization as a nation. To be fair to principles, I don't even know what principles do exactly, but based on a couple they showed, it seems to be about how block members interact with each other, as the defensive cooperation principles do things like disallowing internal wars, or making defensive pacts between everyone. Beyond that, we've got leverage, which is how a nation is forced into a block, and is based on a few things, but most interestingly, economic dependence. This idea of economic dependence is very interesting, and is covered in a later dev diary, Diary 111. This seems to be more or less connected to how much of the pops in a country have their needs provided by another country. Essentially, that means you just need to export a ton or do some foreign investment in that country in order to pull them into your block. The question here is why I would want to expand my block. From what I can see, adding new block members harms cohesion, and although I'm not sure what cohesion does, it's likely that I want high cohesion. I assume that the benefit of a new block member is based on the principles I pick, so this is very much so a case of needing to wait until the DLC comes out to properly evaluate the system. It could be possible this is an amazing system, but it could also be a complete throwaway system. terms of what I'd like to see, I want Blocs to have a strong sense of identity, and it looks to me like that's what it's trying to do. That's very good. Blocs have a ton of potential to be anything from a relatively innocuous but fun roleplay system to a game-altering mode of diplomacy as Blocs fight for control over smaller nations to exploit. Right now, Victoria 3 is all about resources, since the economics and supply chains define basically everything. That gameplay loop of acquiring resources and then using them is basically the only gameplay loop around which every other system is based, but with power blocks we could see a whole new gameplay loop appearing. Trying to keep your power block relevant and compete with other power blocks by leveraging smaller nations could be interesting. It's all going to depend on what exactly you get from obtaining a new block member. For example, it's pretty clear that for the Prussian power block shown in the diary, the Zollverein, that each member joins the market, which is a benefit for Prussia in that way. But what about the British block? That one is almost certainly an empire based around subjugating members of the bloc, but that begs the question of why anyone would join. If I'm playing the Sick Empire in the current patch, it's entirely viable to join the British market and just never get subjugated completely, so you can build up until you're ready to face Britain. In the new power block system, would it be a prerequisite for the Six to become a subject of Britain in order to access their market? Maybe, in which case that's actually a pretty cool trade-off in a way, since subjugation isn't necessarily the end of the world. Again, major point is that there are so many questions and very little answers. I really want to see some unique, and in theory rather pointless, block types, if only because roleplay is lots of fun in Victoria 3. It's obvious that a power block which focuses on religious conversion isn't really that useful, since at the end of the day, converting pops isn't all that useful when total separation exists. But if I want to spread Sikhism around as the Sikh Empire or something, it would be nice to have options beyond religious schools for that. I genuinely do appreciate when games like CK3 or Vic3 include theoretically non-viable options just for fun. Even industry banned in Vic3, which is quite useless, is still a welcome addition just because it can be fun to be Amish. That's power blocks more or less, and it's certainly a huge opportunity to add to the game immensely. Let's talk about building ownership and foreign investment now. This is actually the system I'm most excited about simply because of my previous complaints about ownership being strangely restrictive. Those restrictions are now gone, thank goodness. Buildings can be owned by workers right from the get-go, or owned by aristocrats and capitalists from anywhere in the country thanks to the new manor house buildings. Looking at Diary 110, we can see this three-way split which I talked about back in my own video all that time ago. There are worker-owned, privately owned, and country-owned ownerships for every building, and at first, each building is constructed with worker and country-owned ownership until a button to allow private investing is clicked on. I really love this system because it better reflects the realities of the time. I had said in my old video that it was 100% the case that the British Crown owned stuff, and yet in that era of Vic 3, there was no government ownership unless Britain abolished the free market to embrace a command economy, with the explicit exception of railways under interventionism, which could be made government owned, despite them being one of the best examples of a very strongly privately owned institution. This in theory massively affects the gameplay loop, as it will now be an important decision to figure out which businesses should be worker owned, which should be government owned, and which should be private. In theory, this will create a split of priority between the investment pool, which is your private ownership, your standard of living, which is worker ownership, and the government budget, which is government ownership. Based on the diary, it looks like capitalists can invest in buildings across the entire market, not just the same country, so they could have huge impacts on large empires like Britain and France. The question of implementation comes down to how easily a nation can invest in another nation and why you would do that. If I'm Britain, what reason would my capitalists have to buy up iron mines overseas instead of in Yorkshire? My best guess for that would be that Britain itself has an interest in keeping local businesses either government or worker controlled, since it is to Britain's benefit to increase its local standard of living or to add the revenue to its budget. If I'm playing in Upper Canada, I probably wouldn't want Britain buying too many of my ownership levels because then I would be losing out on those dividends entirely. Neither my capitalists, nor my workers, nor my budget would be benefiting from the profits. This brings up nationalization, which I quite like as an idea because it feels appropriate to the era, and feels like another interesting strategic choice. The implementation question is, what is the consequence to nationalization? We can either seize ownership or buy it out via nationalization, and that begs the question of whether a country can refuse to be bought out. I assume that because the choice is in the hands of the capitalists, they decide to get bought out, not the country they come from. So my best guess is that if you buy out private ownership shares, then it is always accepted. The diary mentions that if you refuse to pay them though, the nation can refuse, and if so, it becomes a war goal. What will matter here is what the war goal wants. Is this a defend the capital type of war goal, or is it a occupy the enemy capital war goal? This war goal, with how war goals currently work, could either be very good or very bad. I already imagine a world where the Sikh Empire gets a ton of foreign investment from Russia, and then nationalizes it by occupying Alaska. Or I imagine a world where the same thing happens, but Russia has no way to access Punjab, so it can't occupy it, and the Sikhs get nationalization for free. This war goal could be very broken, and to be fair, investing in a country against whom you have no way to occupy could be seen as a poor decision, and maybe we'll only see investments from countries who have some ability to keep their assets. I do like the alternative of just paying for it all. I also like that laissez-faire will now be a much more limiting system, because right now, laissez-faire doesn't feel very different. It just means you can't downsize. But with the way the law works according to this diary, you won't be able to nationalize anything, and that's a great downside for the extra investment efficiency. The last thing to look at here is foreign investment, which is a pact between countries that lets them invest in each other, or it can be one way, but regardless, I do really like this. The only question I have about is whether or not the resources from a foreign investment go to the owner's market or the buildings market. If I invest in Siam's opium as Russia, I should get the dividends, but do I also get the opium? If I do get the opium, would that mean Siam's only benefit for foreign investment is the wages for the workers? I imagine the opium stays in Siam's market, and that way Siam has an incentive to actually allow foreign investment. Russia could of course set up trade routes and stuff, although I wonder if Siam could simultaneously accept foreign investment and then embargo the nation investing in them. I'm not sure how foreign investment will work with embargoes, but considering that foreign investments are a diplomatic pact, it would be pretty easy to just make embargoes impossible for people with those pacts. The better question is how war would work for foreign investments. If I'm playing Siam, and I have 15 levels of opium farms from France, and then France tries to make me a protectorate, can I nationalize those opium farms right away? Is the war itself a pretext to nationalize? Do I have to add a new war goal to nationalize? What if France declares war but I don't want to take back the foreign investments for whatever reason? Does that mean I'll be at war with a nation whose capitalists now own my opium? Could it be a good strategy to invest in someone's weapons manufacturers and then go to war with them and close down their weapons? There's so many possible ideas for this, but how they'll go is going to be decided by how restrictive nationalization will be. How much power do foreign investors have over the buildings they control? Imagine a Britain which has successfully purchased all the arms industries of France, and then they swap them to the worst production methods to intentionally create shortages. Even if France and Britain are not going to war, Britain can hamstring France in that way. Or the opposite can happen. Maybe France can swap the production methods on the British-owned weapons industries to make them unprofitable and screw Britain out of the dividends. Honestly, I think it's a simple fix. Just make it so that whoever owns 51% of the ownership shares gets to control it, or if there's no majority, just whoever owns the largest number of shares, with worker and government shares counting for the building owner country. So if Bavaria has a textile industry which is 30% worker owned, 30% Prussia owned, 30% France owned, and 10% government owned, then the workers and government add up to 40%, so Bavaria can decide the production methods, whereas if Prussia had 50%, then it could decide the production methods itself. What do we do if it's an exact 50-50 split? Not sure. I guess let the higher prestige country control it in that case. That implementation could be very important, and although I love these ideas, there could be a whole lot wrong with it once it comes out. Either way, I'm very excited for these new ownership mechanics, and I think they'll really revitalize the game if they're done right. Let's look at subject interactions now, which is a bit of a smaller addition from what I can tell. There's a new sort of push and pull system with autonomy, which I quite like. Liberty desire is based on a few factors, and most interestingly, the economic dependence of that subject on the overlord. Dependence is based on how much of their ownership the overlord controls in that country. Essentially, the more you invest in a subject, the more dependent they are on you, and I really love that because it means you have to really consider your subjects. Playing as Britain, I could see it being a new source of strategic decision making to consider which subject should be invested in and what to invest in for those subjects. It would benefit Britain to invest in opium farms in Bengal, but that wouldn't make them as dependent as if they were to invest in their grain or clothes. The push and pull of a subject trying to become more independent economically compared to the overlord pulling them back in makes both subject and overlord gameplay more interesting, but where I can see problems is, as usual, how the AI will handle this, but more importantly, how exactly economic dependence will be calculated. It is intuitive to say that if British capitalists control all the food of a country, they are suddenly quite economically dependent, since without those British farms, they'll find themselves starving, but at the same time, can that not be remedied by an immediate nationalization? Why would overlord control over businesses really even matter for economic dependence when there exists nationalization? Looking at Diary 111, we see the dependence is measured in a few aspects. First, the GDP owned by the overlord, then the GDP difference, and the needs for pops are fulfilled by goods from each country. The more a subject provides goods that the overlord needs, the more independence they get, and I like this a lot, but I'm also not sure how competitiveness will work. For example, if both Britain and the East India Company are producing clothes in their own states, how will we determine from where the pops buy? Presumably, since the goods are in a shared market in this scenario, and with how Victoria 3 economics work, the only change that more goods make is lowering the price of the goods. I suppose that if 10,000 clothes are being purchased across the market, and Britain produces 2,000 of them, while the Raj produces 8,000 of them, that would imply that the Raj will be independent of the British, but we also have to account for the massive population difference between the two. This gets complicated in a market like the British one, with so many contributors and potential trade networks between so many of them and others in foreign markets. This is again an issue of exact implementation. There's no way that I know of anyway to choose who to acquire goods from, and if I'm playing in India, the choice to purchase clothes from overseas instead of from Britain could be an important step towards independence. That being said, I also think it's wise to not allow a subject to just choose to not buy from its overlord despite its liberty desire, because that would be frustrating for the overlord. Looking again at the diary, it looks like dependence is based on the difference in price between the goods of the theoretical subject market and the actual total market. That should be fine for now, but it is also mentioned that this is a work in progress calculation, so it may be different from the future. Moving on from the complexity of dependence, we get to move to the more direct subject interactions like reducing or increasing subject payments. It's nice sometimes to keep it simple. Spend some influence to increase the taxes you take from a subject, and in return they gain liberty desire. Nice and easy. I'm definitely interested in the grant market interactions, as that could mean those treaty ports that France and Portugal have in India may actually be useful finally. If Britain decides to create a very autonomous East India Company, Pondicherry and Goa will actually activate, and why Britain would do that is an interesting question, but it does nonetheless give France an interest in potentially sowing discontent between India and Britain, with the hope that Britain might choose to give out the market to smooth things over. I love, in theory, how this creates new opportunities for ways to harm another nation, and I think it will be a good system. That being said, if the calculations for liberty desire end up being too convoluted or nonsensical, and if the AI isn't capable of considering how it might seek greater autonomy or seek to free other subjects, it could become a relatively flat system. I could see it being very frustrating to deal with an overzealous AI who is constantly seeking to undermine subject relations, which although it would likely be relatively historically accurate, it wouldn't be particularly fun. I think the best way to have the system exist would be to tie it closely to rivalries. Usually, in any given run, if you don't step on any toes, you end up with maybe one rival at most, and if you go hard, you can get every great power gunning for you. If you want to keep your subject relations stable and free of interference, then look inwards and ignore the outside world, but if you get many rivals who seek your downfall, then you will lose stability. Beyond that, we get an updated system for enforcing laws on our subjects, and the ability to support independence, which are both welcome mechanics. Supporting independence is a bit weird because of war goals to me. It would be entirely possible to support independence just to annoy Britain and then capitulate the second the war starts, leaving India on its own. Depending on how it goes for subjects who fail independence wars, this could be a good or bad move, but either way, it is connected to the larger issues with diplomatic plays as a whole, which as far as I know are not being updated in this DLC and patch. Regardless, I wanted to take a quick moment to show you exactly how awesome all these ideas are, especially in comparison to the relatively small additions we got from agitators and the like. Agitators were fine, and that's okay, just fine as an acceptable place to be, but these changes in sphere of influence are fundamentally altering the game, and that leaves so much room for both error and success. The ideas are amazing and create new gameplay loops while also improving existing ones. I really hope these turn out well. The only mechanic I've seen so far that I'm not really digging is the lobbying groups from Diary 112. I fear the restrictive nature of lobbies to some extent, but also welcome the additional challenge and guidance they provide. In general, I don't like it when Paradox games get more railroaded, akin to mission trees in EU4. I like when the game is a proper sandbox with lots of options, but with lobbies we may see a strong push to engage in diplomacy that you otherwise wouldn't. And to be clear, this is much more of a personal preference than a bad idea. Having powerful interest groups attempt to influence not just domestic but foreign policy is an interesting idea, but I only fear for how the list of ways to appease or displease a lobby could be quite short and lack dynamism. If I get a lobby that supports a particular country and I don't really want it, I'm curious as to how I might dismantle that lobby. We can create lobbies by funding them overseas according to the diary, but how does a lobby go away? If I completely appease a lobby and they give huge approval to the interest groups within it, does that lobby eventually dissipate? Another important question is what those interest groups have to gain from being in a political lobby. If the industrialists of Britain enter a lobby seeking friendship with the Americans, I wonder what they get out of those better relations. In the case of a trade agreement, there may be higher profits for the capitalists, which is certainly one thing, but other than that, what's the goal? My point is that every interest group, at least domestically, tends to advocate for laws which benefit the pops that make up their clout. The rural folk want agrarianism because the farmers benefit from it, and the industrialists want laissez-faire because the capitalists benefit. The landed gentry want slavery because it increases their influence, and so on. Why would the landed gentry of Britain seek friendship with America? Maybe it's ideological, which you definitely could make work. Perhaps if a country embraces laissez-faire policies, the industrialists will start a lobby to support them, and this is sort of mentioned via the diplomatic catalysts in this very diary. My biggest concern here is that lobbies will be more of an annoyance than an interesting mechanic to interact with. I can see the good and bad sides of this system, and with the right implementation, I think it'll be okay, but so far it's the only idea which I believe appears to be flawed, unlike everything else which appears to be almost a perfect idea. I do really like the ability to bankroll a foreign lobby in the hopes of creating friendly relations, except that it is chance-based, just like with obligations from bankrolls already. Obviously, Victoria 3 has a lot of problems with regards to RNG, and the game does need some RNG to keep things interesting, but I will probably find myself pulling my hair out after investing millions of pounds into other countries' pops, only to see nothing come of it. And I may even feel as a target country of a fun lobby interaction that I dislike how another country is influencing my politics without me being able to stop it. Much like with foreign investments and embargoes, I imagine we'll be limited to only being able to fund lobbies in countries that are at least neutral towards us, but it could still be frustrating nonetheless. I can even see a situation where the lobby funding increases the standard of living at some pops, and then once funding stops, they lose that standard of living and become radicals due to losing that level of wealth. That could be exploited to cause turmoil, which would be absolutely awful. Regardless, it's one contentious thought in a pile of good ones, so I doubt it would drag the whole game down. That being said, it's easy to focus on the negative for games like Victoria 3, which lacks some of the goodwill that other titles might have. We've got just one more mechanic to look at as of April 18th, which is when I wrote this script, and that's the diplomatic catalysts. More stuff may come out in the following weeks, but as of now, this is all we got. Catalysts are huge for the game for a reason that you might not have expected, and that is that they provide transparency to the game. Remember that schizo AI I mentioned before? Catalysts don't necessarily fix the schizo AI, but they do explain it. Essentially, catalysts are a transparency measure to show you when and how particular actions influence relations. There's a direct tie-in with Lobbies in Diary 113 as a Brazilian-American lobby gets formed, and the listed catalyst is from forming a diplomatic pact with America. Whether or not it's justified that such a lobby should form, or whether or not it makes sense, just getting the explanation is so huge. Now in the future, I can be aware that forming pacts could cause a lobby to form, and although it's possible to learn that by diving into the game files and checking for triggers, it's much nicer and more user-friendly to have that information be displayed in-game like this. Catalysts are relatively simple in that way. This is not some huge game-changing system, but instead an attempt at remedying the RNG in the game in a way that doesn't remove it, which I like. Another example that's shown is how Ashanti goes bankrupt, which makes Britain become more aggressive. This makes sense, since Ashanti is weakened and now the British see an opportunity. It may have already been the case in the game this would have happened, but now we get to know why explicitly it happened. It's a small change, but it's wildly important. It may also radically alter how the current reverse sway system works. Right now, a meta strategy is to do what generalist gaming has dubbed the yo-yo sway, which is when you join a play against the person you want to sway, so you can make them think the war is more dire than it looks, and thus offer more stuff to you when swaying. It's slightly limited sometimes, but it makes no real sense. Yo-yo sways are basically extortion, and yet the AI will feel happy with you for coming to their side. In some ways, the schizophrenic plays from the AI can be kind of fun since they are often meme-worthy, so part of me feels like this is the ultimate answer to that problem. To make the AI too robotic and simplistic to predict would make the game too easily solved, and yet it is frustrating when things are too unpredictable. With diplomatic catalysts, we now have enough transparency to predict the AI, or at least learn after the fact what happened, without losing out on that charming bit of randomness. Beyond that, there isn't much to cover for catalysts. That leaves us with some of the minor flavor additions to the game, like new companies and new journal entries, which I'm going to lump together as a kind of miscellaneous section. Flavor is, to me, a very controversial thing. I've heard many people talk about how Victoria 3 lacks flavor. I don't believe that flavor is actually very important to any Paradox game. It's perhaps one of the least important aspects of the game because flavor, in the forms that it often presents itself, is just a series of predetermined events. In Europa Universalis 4, mission trees are flavor, and although that game has taken great strides to create complex, branching mission trees that feel like more than predetermined events, they are still ultimately just that. Consider a branching mission tree with as many as 10 outcomes, which certainly doesn't exist, but follow me here. Those 10 outcomes are still less numerous than the potential outcomes of a game of CK3 with every flavor decision stripped out of it. My point is that these games thrive on many possible outcomes, and the potential for crazy alternative histories. Journals fill a similar role to mission trees, to guide the game to a lesser or greater extent. Let's look at the Great Game, as it's called, which is about the competition between Russia and Britain over control in Central Asia. Let me ask you this. What's better? A journal entry, or a game whose mechanics dynamically create a situation where Russia and Britain would be fighting over Central Asia? See, in the current game, it's already in Russia's interest to gain power in Central Asia so it can access the Sikh Empire and potentially gain Punjab's silken dyes for itself, alongside the Opium of Afghanistan. It takes no journal entry to make a player want to dominate Central Asia. The AI is a little less interested because it's not very good at prioritizing sometimes, but you take my point, I think. I will concede this about journals. They are a solid replacement for an incompetent AI, and what I mean by that is that if the AI can't be convinced of the value of Central Asia, having a journal entry that spurs them towards it is fine. America's westward manifest destiny in the current game is entirely spurred on by a journal entry, and that's fine because otherwise, yeah, the AI probably wouldn't even bother, and we'd see a lot of Americans that choose to be buddies with Mexico. That all being said, and with my skepticism out of the way, I'll nonetheless say that I do like the Great Game as an idea because it seems like something with a lot of stuff going on. Looking at the screenshot on the Steam store page for the DLC, which is about all we have to go on, we see a pretty extensive set of journal entries related to the larger Great Game journal entry. Cool. I hope there are nice rewards and interesting interactions with that. Flavor is never a bad thing as long as it doesn't railroad the game. A great example of flavor done right is CK3's culture system, which does to some extent railroad the game. In every game, the cultures of particular regions will have certain traditions that will drive their AI towards certain actions, but because those cultures are so fluid and their influence is ultimately under the hood, it ends up not causing such railroading that it ruins the chaotic fun of the game. Simultaneously, it adds an appropriate amount of consistency to certain parts of the game. Vikings in CK3 always raid, thanks to their faith and culture traditions. In that same vein, America should always try and push west, and Russia should fight with Britain to control Central Asia. What I'm hoping for is a great game that doesn't end the same way every time. So long as that stays the case, it'll be fine. Beyond that, new companies are an example of flavor which I'm all for. Companies generally are not so broken that they can upset the game balance, and although some companies are way better than others, it's still entirely viable to roleplay and take a less optimal company if it feels more fun. I can only see more companies being a good thing for the game, assuming they function in the same way in the future as they do now. I would certainly be open to companies having expanded purposes though, maybe influencing lobbies and the like. One form of flavor I'm really hoping for is this focus on ideology. In the current game, it is advertised that becoming a Council Republic will make other countries dislike you, but to be quite frank, this is just kind of not the case. Generally speaking, becoming a Council Republic elicits a minor at most reaction from your neighbors, but in reality it should be a movement that ought to be crushed immediately by every monarchist around. Right now you can choose to regime change other nations with a war goal, and sometimes that can be useful for maybe opening a subject's borders or just for roleplay, but I'd really like a world where enforcing the ideology of your government or perhaps power bloc would have some kind of consequence. To play a radical French Republic seeking to destroy the monarchies of Europe right now is a fun roleplay scenario, but ultimately is quite pointless. It would be cool to see that idea expanded into some kind of system of ideological dominance. The only problem is I can't think of a reward for that other than just prestige or maybe the expansion of a power bloc. It's hard to say how the game should encourage ideological cohesion, but maybe it can be as simple as just giving powerful modifiers to nations that pursue their ideology's dominance in their home region. I'm getting a bit too far into the theoretical now, and although it's nice to sit and dream about what the game could be, it's all too easy to be swept up in a storm of expectations. My expectations for Victoria 3 have fluctuated so much throughout its time on the market. When I first bought the game, I was stunned by its economic systems. They're truly one of a kind in the grand strategy world, but after a few hundred hours of play, I found the game to be solved economically. Every game became about getting iron and coal to make steel, using the steel for engines, and then making railways. Then with rails, I would build enough buildings in every state that mattered for me to employ everyone, and once everyone was employed, I sat and watched the GDP and standard of living rise. In reality, the game wasn't really solved, but it felt that way. Sometimes my feeling is more important than reality though, as it made me lose interest in the game. Then we saw some flavor packs with the agitators and Brazil flavor coming to the game. That was nice. I did one playthrough as Brazil, and I used agitators to do some funny stuff here and there, but it just wasn't bringing me back into the game. Every once in a while, I dipped my toes back in, only to find myself disappointed by the jankiness of the game. Victoria 3 is a truly strange game. The psychotic AI and the broken military systems, alongside navies being strange and naval landings feeling weird, all contributed to the larger sense that Victoria 3 was this strange, incomplete mess of a game. Despite that, its charm kept on pulling me back in, at least briefly. I actually owe my recent Victoria 3 renaissance to Generalist Gaming, who I think looked at the game differently than I did. He plays the game similarly to how I play Crusader Kings 3, and that surprised me because I didn't understand how a person could derive any kind of reliable fun from such a broken mess. But learning to accept that Iron Man mode isn't viable, and learning to manipulate the broken systems put it all together for me. When Generalist plays Victoria 3, he's trying to achieve some kind of goal that he has in his mind, and the fun for him is finding the optimal path to that goal. Picking the right companies, building the right buildings, and taking advantage of the diplomatic plays that present themselves. That is the fun of Victoria 3, and with that in mind, this DLC looks like it will expand on all of that significantly. I've learned to love the janky nature of Victoria 3, and with what Sphere of Influence may offer, I think that jank could potentially get worse. I have embraced the jank. Now I just want to see where else it can go with these new mechanics. Sphere of Influence promises a lot, and its delay was disheartening, but at the same time, it makes me think something of much higher quality is cooking. My expectations are honestly pretty low though. I'm not letting the hype get to me, but instead I'm just a scientific observer. I want to see where this goes, and when it comes, I'm excited to check it out and either laugh at how bad it is or enjoy the quality it brings. Thank you for your time.